Okay, think about the last time you maybe tripped, got a little scrape on your knee, or maybe just, brush your hand against a rough wall.
Right, and what happens almost immediately? Your body just kicks into gear, doesn't it?
Totally. Maybe a little bleeding, but then it slows, stops. A scab forms, like a natural little bandage.
And underneath all that, there's this incredibly complex, silent process just unfolding. The body repairing itself, all on its own.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? This sort of fundamental, just inherent ability the body has. We see it with small stuff all the time. Paper cuts, bruises fading away, even broken bones knitting back together, sometimes stronger.
Which leads us really to the big question for this deep dive. Can that same body, with all that innate wisdom, can it actually heal itself from chronic illness?
And if it can, what conditions does it need? And maybe more pointedly, why does this whole idea seem, well, almost at odds with a lot of modern conventional ways of thinking about health?
That's exactly what we're digging into. We're basing this whole discussion today on one particular source. Is a really rich conversation from a YouTube channel. They explore these exact questions with someone who has this really powerful personal story about self-healing.
Yeah, and some pretty sharp takes on the health systems around us, too.
Definitely. So our mission here is basically to unpack the key insights, the arguments, the personal experiences that are shared in that specific conversation.
We want to help you, the listener, get a clearer picture of the different viewpoints on health, on illness, and, on the potential for healing that this source material lays out.
So expect to hear about the body's own intelligence, the absolutely critical role of lifestyle, some pretty significant critiques of established systems.
And also the importance of personal responsibility, mindset, that kind of thing. It's a lot to cover.
It is. Okay, so let's jump right in. The source starts, as you mentioned, with that simple knee scrape. The core idea right off the bat is that self-healing isn't some, special alternative thing. It's the baseline. It's what the body does.
Right. It's always trying to find balance, repair damage, fight off stuff. It's automatic, basically.
The source speaker puts it very plainly. You fall, scrape your knee, it heals. You don't micromanage it. It just happens.
So the real question from this perspective isn't if the body can heal itself. It obviously does, but more like, are you giving it the right conditions to heal?
That nuance is absolutely key. It's central to the source's whole argument. Think about that scrape again. What stops it healing?
Well, if you don't clean it right, or keep picking at it, or keep banging the same spot,
right,
or let it get infected.
Exactly. You'd be interfering, maybe without even meaning to, but you'd be blocking the natural repair job.
You're creating an environment where healing is just harder or maybe impossible.
And the source basically extends that idea to our internal environment, too. They suggest sometimes the inside needs help, like maybe cleaning out toxins or using supports, maybe plant-based things they mention later, to help the body do its thing.
They talk about the body being mysterious, super complex, sophisticated.
Yeah.
But the ability to heal is always there, underneath it all.
So the limit isn't the body's capability, it's the environment we create for it. Internally, externally, through our choices, our exposures.
Yeah, the source really hammers this point about keeping the body in a consistently good state. If your system is constantly fighting off, say, toxins from processed food, or dealing with chronic stress, lack of sleep, pollution, its resources are already tied up.
It's like that wound analogy again. If you keep rubbing the wound, it never gets a chance to close up properly.
Constantly re-injuring it.
Right. And if you keep putting harmful stuff into your system, you're doing the same thing internally. You're interrupting or diverting the energy the body needs for healing.
The healing mechanism is automatic, yes. But whether it gets the job done depends on whether we're helping or hindering.
And the source gives this really vivid personal story to back this up about getting really severe dengue fever in Thailand.
Oof, sounds rough.
Yeah, they describe a super high fever, almost 40 Celsius, causing hallucinations, intense pain, just total exhaustion. And they point out, conventionally, dengue is seen as really dangerous, potentially fatal. People often end up hospitalized for weeks.
But that wasn't their experience.
Not exactly. They were definitely very sick, but they believed their body handled it relatively well because of its underlying strength. Now, they do mention using some supportive things, papaya leaf juice, and something called MMS.
Okay, just noting that's what the source speaker mentions using.
Right. But the main point they draw from it all is the condition their body was in before they even got sick.
Okay, so they were already living healthy.
That's their argument. They stress that because they'd been consistently focusing on good habits, regular exercise, good sleep, nutritious food, their immune system was strong enough to cope effectively.
Unlike perhaps someone whose system is already overloaded just dealing with, say, a typical modern Western diet and lifestyle.
Exactly. In their view, if your immune system is constantly fighting off toxins day to day, when a big challenge like dengue hits, it just doesn't have the reserves. Its energy is already depleted or busy elsewhere.
So the dengue story really reinforces that first point. Giving the body the right underlying conditions is maybe the biggest factor in how it handles acute illness.
Which sort of sets the stage for looking at the bigger picture of chronic illness today as the source sees it.
Yeah, they observe something pretty disturbing, that illness has almost become normalized. Like,
Yeah.
it's so common, maybe people don't even talk about their specific issues much anymore, or they just accept them as, a normal part of life now.
And they back this up with some pretty stark statistics. Now, these are the figures cited in the source material. Around 90% of the global population supposedly has some health issue, about half dealing with chronic diseases,
Half the population, wow.
and maybe 25-30% with autoimmune conditions. And they list all the familiar culprits: stomach pain, migraines, thyroid issues, cholesterol problems. The list goes on.
It really makes you ask the question they pose, why? Why are so many people seemingly sick today? Is this just how it is, or something fundamentally off?
And this questioning isn't just theoretical for the source speaker. It comes directly from their own really intense personal journey, which started with the diagnosis of ulcerative colitis.
Right, they got diagnosed at only 20 years old during military service. That's an inflammatory bowel disease, chronic inflammation in the colon.
And the conventional medical view they got was pretty bleak, basically. It's chronic, it's incurable. Doctors apparently said they didn't really know the cause. Maybe genetics, maybe just bad luck.
So what was the treatment plan?
Lifelong medication. For 8 years, they were taking this cocktail of drugs 3 times a day, every single day.
8 years.
Yeah. And then, you know how it goes. Side effects started cropping up from the meds, which meant more drugs to manage the side effects. But even with all that, they still had constant symptoms, chronic headaches, skin issues, getting sick all the time.
That sounds incredibly draining, just living like that.
Absolutely. But then came a turning point. They were exposed to different ideas, alternative health concepts, the body's ability to heal, and specifically the huge impact of diet, particularly this idea of inflammatory foods.
And this was new information to them, after years of dealing with an inflammatory disease.
Apparently so. They expressed real surprise, like, why didn't anyone mention diet before? It seems that realization was a huge catalyst.
So what did they do?
They dove deep, intensive personal research, and then some pretty radical self-experimentation.
Yeah.
We're talking things the source speaker admits sound unconventional, maybe even dangerous from a standard view. They mentioned trying a self-administered stool transplant, even months of deliberate bee sting therapy.
Wow, that's serious commitment. Shows a real desperation to find something that worked.
Exactly, a deep frustration with the status quo. But the big breakthrough, the thing they keep coming back to, was realizing that lifestyle changes, especially diet, were the key.
And the result?
Pretty dramatic, according to their account. Within 6 months of making these focused changes, they were completely off all medications. Tests showed no signs of inflammation. They say their life was totally transformed.
Incredible. It really brings it back to that rubbing the wound idea, doesn't it? They stopped the constant irritation, the inflammatory inputs, and the body could finally do its healing work.
Precisely. And this personal healing wasn't the end point. It was actually the start of asking bigger questions, like, why did I get sick in the first place if my body could heal? How do I stop it coming back? And bigger still, why are so many other people dealing with chronic illness? That personal victory led to much deeper research.
Which brings us to a really significant part of the source conversation. Their critique of aspects of Western medicine and what they call the broader system.
Yeah, this is where it gets quite pointed. They talk about how even after their recovery, the conventional medical lens might just call it remission.
Right. Remission often implies it's just temporary. The underlying cause isn't fixed, and it'll probably come back.
And the source speaker finds that framing really frustrating. They suggest this whole mindset that serious conditions like colitis or even cancer are basically incurable, that recovery is just a temporary pause is actually part of the problem. It feeds into a culture that normalizes being sick and resists the idea that the body can genuinely heal itself.
They do acknowledge the criticism that often comes up, though. People promoting self-healing, like the source speaker or others they mentioned like Ariadne, sometimes get accused of potentially steering people away from necessary conventional treatment, especially in emergencies like cancer.
Yes, they address that directly. And they offer a few counterpoints based on their perspective and research, which we need to present neutrally as their claims. First, they challenge the idea that Western medicine is always safe or effective. They actually cite a claim, attributing it to research, that medical intervention itself is a major cause of death in the U.S., supposedly the third leading cause, maybe even higher post-COVID.
Okay, so that's a specific claim from the source.
Yes, and they suggest there's evidence, from their view, that some Western treatments don't always work as intended or have significant downsides.
How do they define modern medicine, then?
They characterize modern allopathic medicine, the dominant form for the last 100 years or so, as primarily focused on treating symptoms, not necessarily healing the root cause, using tools like drugs, surgery, radiation.
And that's their main critique. Symptom management versus root cause.
Now, that seems to be the core of it. They argue, for instance, that removing a tumor treats the symptom, but if you don't address why the tumor grew, maybe diet, chemical exposures, mindset, the underlying issue remains, and the problem is likely to come back.
Makes sense that the conditions haven't changed. What's the other part of their response to the criticism?
It's more philosophical. It's about individual sovereignty. They argue very strongly that you, the individual, are ultimately responsible for your own health.
Meaning you have to evaluate all the information yourself, from doctors, podcasts, anywhere.
Exactly. They argue it's your job to weigh the information, assess the practitioners, and make your own informed decisions. It pushes back against just passively accepting authority, even medical authority.
So questioning the doctors, too.
Yes. They challenge the habit of just handing over our autonomy, our sovereignty over our own bodies to authority figures. They argue we need to evaluate everything critically, even within the conventional system.
They also touch on the limits of science itself, right?
Yeah, they acknowledge science is useful, obviously, but argue that life and humans are incredibly complex. There's the mind, free will, personal experience, maybe even mystery, things science might not fully capture yet.
And they mention an article, something about evidence-based medicine.
All right, they bring up an article reportedly from the British Medical Journal, BMJ, in 2015, titled something like The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. They claim this piece, written by doctors, suggests that economic interests heavily influence research and academia, making it hard to know what data is truly reliable, especially if it's tied to selling something, like drugs.
Which leads directly into their claims about big pharma influence.
Yes. The source speaker alleges this influence is widespread. They claim it affects medical schools, mentioning things like buildings named after pharma companies, and curricula allegedly shifting away from natural healing towards drug therapies over time.
And controlling information in the media, too.
That's their claim. They argue the economic motive is strong profit lies in selling drugs and treatments. They allude to things like the opioid crisis, referencing shows like Dope Sick without naming it.
And the COVID era comes up again here.
Yes, as a major example from their perspective. They claim specific narratives were pushed heavily, while other information was suppressed, only for different data to emerge later.
They use that sunscreen example, too, to show conflicting science. Avoid sun for cancer risk, but lack of sun vitamin D also linked to cancer risk.
Exactly. They argue it forces individuals to realize that science isn't always monolithic and that you have to investigate and decide for yourself what makes sense.
They also bring in a historical angle, contrasting Hippocrates with modern medicine.
Right. They paint a picture of Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, believing the body heals itself if you don't interfere, focusing on basics like diet, fasting, water. Then they claim a major shift happened about 100 years ago.
With figures like Rockefeller.
That's who they mention. They suggest Rockefeller, with ties to the oil industry, which is the basis for many pharmaceuticals, saw a huge economic opportunity in medicine and actively promoted the allopathic drug-based model.
And actively suppressed natural or traditional approaches.
That's the narrative presented in the source. They claim there was a deliberate effort to marginalize natural healing, label it alternative or unscientific, and cement the drug-based approach in medical schools and public perception.
So, looking at the rise in chronic illness and drug use today, the source asks, is this really progress?
Or could it be, they speculate, the intended result of that economic shift? They acknowledge the counter-argument about better diagnostics finding more illness today, but they seem unconvinced it explains the whole picture.
What about the motive? Are they suggesting it's deliberately malicious?
Not necessarily intentional harm, according to the speaker. They lean more towards economic drivers, using that analogy. A box of cornflakes is much more profitable than selling an apple. They see large organizations as often acting like faceless, heartless entities prioritizing profit.
And they question the role of governments and health ministries in this.
Yes. They ask why, if diet is known to prevent most chronic diseases, citing WHO according to the source, do health ministries allow widespread sale of inflammatory foods? They contrast the swift, strict enforcement of things like COVID mask mandates with what they see as inaction on promoting healthy diets.
That's a sharp contrast. They even make a specific claim about Pfizer funding during COVID.
Yes, they claim Pfizer was a big donor to the Ministry of Health then. Again, presenting this as a specific claim from the source speaker.
They also talk about branding, like calling it the Ministry of Health.
Right, how the name itself builds trust. And they suggest that maybe generations of doctors and officials are, in a sense, indoctrinated. They might sincerely believe in the system they're part of without fully seeing the historical or economic influences that shaped it.
And they mention doctors who dissent facing consequences.
Yes. They claim doctors who speak out or promote alternatives, naming people like Ari Avni and Gil-Yosef Shachar, can face censorship or punishment, referencing laws allegedly passed during COVID that tightened control.
So why don't more people see it this way, according to the source?
Their view is that people are conditioned to trust mainstream media and official sources. But they argue these outlets are fundamentally selling something: ideas, fear, products, politicians, not necessarily objective truth. They make the bold claim that often what's presented as healthy or true in the media is actually the opposite.
So where do you find good info, in their view?
It takes effort. Seeking alternative sources, maybe platforms like Twitter X, Instagram, doing your own digging. But it's complex, lots of noise. Their advice: look for personal stories, logical arguments, and then crucially experiment yourself. See what actually works for you. Which leads us perfectly into the more practical side. What steps can people actually take towards self-healing based on the source's experience and recommendations?
Right. The first big idea is reframing illness. See it not as just a problem, but as a message. Information from your body.
Yeah, an opportunity to stop and look. A signal that something needs attention. Sleep, diet, stress, maybe even how you're living your life. Are you expressing yourself?
But just understanding the message isn't enough, right?
No, action is key. The source emphasizes that healing really starts when you act on that information, when you make those changes.
So where's a good place to start?
Listen to your body's signals, even the scary ones. The speaker talks about their own experience with bleeding, terrifying, obviously, but facing that fear and being willing to explore beyond the standard path was crucial. Don't be afraid to try something new.
They also frame it as building a relationship with yourself.
Exactly. Spending dedicated time on your own well-being. Simple things like reading instead of phone scrolling before bed, trying meditation, cold showers, exercise. Maybe consciously choosing less draining social time and more me time focused on health.
And diet comes up again as a major starting point.
Yeah, partly because our relationship with food is so deep, so emotional. We eat when bored, sad, happy, lonely, celebrating. Tackling diet touches on a lot of things.
They also link poor sleep to food cravings, right? Craving sugar for energy.
Yes, they mention that connection, citing someone named Amos Ziv. It shows how interconnected it all is.
And the core dietary concept they push is nutrient density.
Right. Focusing on real, whole foods, fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes, good quality meat, eggs, fish, the stuff that actually gives your body the building blocks it needs to repair, grow, strengthen itself, like breast milk for a baby, providing everything needed.
They also explained inflammation again, the difference between acute and chronic.
Yeah, acute inflammation is good, necessary for healing that knee scrape. Chronic inflammation, silent inflammation, or inflammaging, is when that process gets stuck on because the irritants, often processed foods, are always present.
They even linked chronic inflammation to burning easily in the sun.
That was an interesting point they made, yeah.
So how do you know if you have chronic inflammation? Blood tests like CRP.
They mention that, but really emphasize that the actions, the lifestyle changes, especially diet, are what reduce it. The distinction is clear. Processed food is generally inflammatory. Whole food is generally anti-inflammatory.
Making changes can feel huge, though. Where to begin?
Start small, they suggest. Pick one thing to cut out: dairy, white flour, sugar, seed oils, or add one good thing, a fruit, a veggie, maybe some quality steak once a week. The key is paying attention. How do you feel after the change? Notice energy, digestion, skin, pain.
They have that Eat Like a King challenge idea, too.
Yeah, kind of a fun way to frame it. For a month, Eat really nutrient-dense real food like a king would have. Contrast that with maybe how a subject eating cheaper processed stuff might feel. Compare your energy, focus, sleep, pain. It's a personal experiment.
What else besides diet? Sunlight.
Definitely. Getting some sun for vitamin D. Crucial for the immune system. Even a short time is better than none. And sleep, of course. Prioritize it. Go to bed earlier.
It's tough, though. The world pushes processed food everywhere.
Absolutely. Ads, supermarkets, convenience. It takes conscious effort to choose differently. It's swimming upstream.
But they have that really nice idea. Just starting the work, making that intentional choice to change, that is the healing process beginning, the action itself.
And speaking of actions and ancient wisdom, fasting gets a lot of attention in the source material.
Right. Not as a new trend, but as something really old. They mention Hippocrates again, Maimonides.
Exactly. They mentioned hearing stories like people healing colitis with long, supervised fasts, like 30 days. And they practice it themselves, though not necessarily extreme versions, sometimes intermittent fasting.
Is it scary? The idea of not eating.
They acknowledge it can be, partly because of our emotional ties to food, but their experience with longer fast days, even a week, was revealing. They didn't feel like they were starving, often felt great, clear-headed.
And freeing.
Yeah, that was a key word. Amazing that you don't eat. It's very freeing. Not being constantly focused on the next meal, even just one meal a day, they suggest, can be beneficial.
But conventional medicine usually advises against fasting.
Generally, yes, outside specific therapeutic contexts. And the source speaker speculates, again linking back to their critique, that maybe there's an economic reason. Food companies and drug companies don't profit if people are fasting and healing themselves.
Okay, so moving from physical practices, what about energy levels? Why are so many people just tired all the time?
The source tackles this head on. They list a whole bunch of modern energy drainers. Constant anxiety, worry, being glued to negative news politics, wars, fear.
Social media comparison too.
Yep. Lack of sleep, obviously. Eating food that doesn't actually nourish you. Not enough sunlight.
But they go deeper than just habits, right? More existential drains.
Absolutely. Things like working a job you hate, having no excitement for the future, not expressing your creativity, feeling like you have to hide parts of yourself, being in toxic relationships.
The core idea seems to be that many people aren't living fully expressed lives, not pursuing their dreams.
That's the perspective presented. And they suggest that while adding good things helps, maybe removing the drainers is even more critical right now, given how much negative input we face.
So what gives energy then?
Meaningful connections, goals, dreams, excitement, desire to get up in the morning, even simple things like making lists, having structure, feeling enthusiasm.
It ties into that idea of a lack of meaning or spirituality in modern life.
Yeah, the source suggests maybe the soul needs challenges, purpose, growth. Maybe fatigue or depression are signals that something fundamental is missing, spiritually or existentially.
They use that hunter-gatherer contrast.
Yeah.
Less time for rumination when focused on survival.
Right, suggesting maybe depression can be, in some ways, a complex privilege of having basic needs met, but lacking deeper connection or purpose. It highlights how much mindset matters for energy.
Finding meaning and excitement, even amid challenges.
Which leads right into the role of mindset, spirituality, and consciously tackling those challenges.
The speaker connected their own physical issues, like colitis and the dengue depression, to potential mental or emotional states.
Yeah, they speculated about links to things like self-criticism or low self-worth for the colitis, and saw depression as a direct, though temporary, effect of the dengue virus.
And they mentioned that idea from Nader Bhutto, even if there's an emotional root, you still need to support the physical body.
Right. Feed the weakened organ well while you work on the deeper stuff. Practical support matters.
They also talked about intentionality during that dengue depression, choosing positive habits even when feeling awful.
Exactly. Making the conscious effort to act your way out of it, even without motivation. Which ties into their point about exercise.
The counterintuitive idea.
Yeah.
Exercise to get energy, don't wait until you have it.
Yes. They stress this. Don't be confused. It doesn't come easily. The energy often follows the action. A really crucial insight.
And just normalizing that effort is required. Healthy choices aren't always easy.
Totally. Paying bills, exercising, eating well, sleeping early. It takes discipline. It's okay if it's a struggle. The effort itself is valuable, builds strength.
They even normalized anxiety a bit as part of choosing a meaningful path.
Yeah, suggesting it can come with growth, with stepping outside your comfort zone.
And they brought back spirituality and faith.
Yeah.
Connecting it to meaning and resilience. mentioned a friend feeling loved after returning to faith.
Yes. And even small acts like blessing food as ways to foster connection, gratitude, maybe even impact how we receive nourishment.
Why might systems discourage faith, according to the source?
Their speculation is that faith connects people to an internal or higher guidance, making them less reliant on external authorities, governments, media, science for answers or meaning. Less reliant means potentially less controllable.
Which brings us to that final big theme: self-learning, autodidacticism, and questioning authority.
Yeah, a strong thread throughout the conversation, the value of teaching yourself, thinking critically, not just accepting what authorities tell you.
Prioritizing your own experience and observation.
Definitely. Using that COVID example, again, what they saw with their own eyes versus the TV narrative fueled their questioning.
And that comparison they made, Octo 7th versus COVID deaths.
Yeah.
That was a striking point from their perspective.
It was. Comparing the almost universal personal connection to Octo 7th victims versus, in their personal experience, knowing very few who died from COVID despite huge reported numbers. Neutrality reminder. Clearly stating this is the source speaker's personal observation and comparison used to illustrate their questioning of narratives, not a host endorsement or verified fact. They said this discrepancy really made them question other official stories,
leading them to that I don't know position about things they can't personally verify, even big historical events or scientific facts.
Right. And it's presented not as ignorance, but as a logical consequence of realizing how much narratives can be controlled or shaped. They mentioned questioning specific details they were taught about events like the Holocaust, for instance, based on their research. Careful phrasing. Emphasize it's about questioning specific details of the narrative learned, not denial of the event, used as an example of scrutinizing all received information. It highlights their deep skepticism about information sources.
Because they see media as salespeople, basically.
Yeah.
Selling ideas, fear, products.
That's their perspective, not necessarily objective truth tellers.
So you have to actively seek diverse info, trust intuition, experiment yourself. They quoted Confucius.
I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Understanding comes from doing, from experiencing, not just hearing.
And this critique extended to academia too, seeing it as an economic system selling degrees.
Yeah, questioning if it truly fosters deep learning or relevant skills anymore, especially with AI. Arguing curricula can be outdated, fixed, serving systemic interests, not encouraging real critical thought or diverse perspectives.
And even primary and secondary school, questioning what's really taught versus what's not taught.
Exactly. Basic skills, maybe some propaganda or limited history, they argue, but not crucial life skills like finance, relationships, self-management, entrepreneurship, critically analyzing systems. Their view is it prepares people to be compliant citizens, accept authority, pay taxes without question.
Leading to that final challenging question they pose. Looking at all these systems, education, media, health, are we actually happier, healthier, more connected as a result?
It's a powerful question to end on. So this deep dive really took us through the body's incredible power to heal if given the chance.
Yeah, the huge impact of lifestyle, especially diet,
Yeah.
anchored by that really compelling personal transformation story.
We also unpacked the source's pretty strong critiques of conventional medicine and information systems, raising big questions about motives, effectiveness, and the stories we're told.
And tying it all together was that emphasis on personal responsibility, questioning authority, finding meaning, and the power of mindset and conscious action.
These aren't just theories, they're ideas that really push you, the listener, to think about taking a more active, more sovereign role in your own health journey, especially in a world that's so full of conflicting messages.
It really comes back to that simple starting point. The healing wisdom is already inside you. It just needs the right conditions. So as we wrap up, here's something to think about, building on everything we've explored today. In a world that often asks you to outsource responsibility for your health and your beliefs, what's one small area, maybe in your health, maybe in your thinking, where you feel inspired now to maybe question an old assumption, do a little digging for yourself, or take just one small intentional step towards reclaiming your own sovereignty?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.